Hi, I'm Tom Burgess, and thank you for listening to The Real Agenda, the podcast for political change. Now, if we do nothing to get involved in politics, there is just one fundamental thing we must do, and that's vote. Yet so many of us don't bother. Only 66.8% of the 45.8 million electorate voted in the 2017 general election. Of that, only 42.4%, that's 13.6 million people, voted for the winning party. That means 70% did not vote for the winning party. So there's no doubt that action on reducing inequality, resolving poverty and bringing greater social and economic justice, what we call the real agenda, is significantly inhibited by our outdated voting system, which favours a bipartisan agenda of inaction, instead of reflecting the will of the people who want to see consensus and compassion to resolve the constant and unnecessary hardship suffered by millions every day, and also to move our country forward. Because for a society to flourish, it must move with the times and adapt. It needs radical change. For a starter, our debating chamber was designed to be a sword's distance apart, so MPs could not poke each other with their swords, when it really should be a handshake distance. In fact, it shouldn't be two sides at all, but a part of a circle. As we know, there are different shades of opinion. It's not just black and white. So to get a perspective on our voting system, I spoke to Klina Jordan, co-founder of Make Votes Matter, and that's exactly what she wants to do. As a lifelong activist, Klina has diverse expertise from a 20-year career, including events, marketing, business development, management and sustainable enterprise before founding Make Votes Matter. Klina focuses on electoral reform because she believes that without proportional representation, we won't be able to take the environmental and social action that's so necessary. I agree there. She believes that we need a real democracy, and to get it, we need to work together. I absolutely agree. So how are we going to make this happen? I started off by asking Klina, what is wrong with our democracy?
The big problem is that it's not a democracy. So the whole point of democracy is that the people are meant to be in power. So the word actually originates from Greek, demos, kratos, the people being in power. But if the majority of people are not being heard, not being represented, then actually you can't in any way call that a democracy. In the UK, the last time we had a party that had majority support from the electorate was 1931. There have been coalitions or confidence and supply agreements since then, which mean that parties get a majority in Parliament, or more than one party gets a majority in Parliament. So, for example, the Conservative and Lib Dem coalition, majority in Parliament is a very different thing to majority support from the population or even the electorate, which is only part of the population. The reason for this is the voting system. So in the UK, we use a voting system called first past the post. This actually originated from horse racing and was outlawed by the Jockey Club not very long after it was introduced because it resulted in too much cheating and kind of illegal stuff happening. So it was basically about the horse that gets past the post at the end of the race first wins whatever. So even if it then transpires that one of the opponent horses has been drugged or there's been some other skullduggery, that horse that won has won regardless. So manipulating the game was a great way of winning bets. So it was about problematic betting. So the Jockey Club ruled that out ages ago, but we still use it as a voting system. But of course in politics there isn't an actual post to get past, and this is part of the problem because it's not even that the post is 50%, it's not that you get a majority of support in a constituency that an MP is elected from, or majority support from the electorate overall in the country. The post could be a very tiny number, as in percentage of votes, like 25%, and this has happened. About a quarter of a constituency have voted for an MP, and that MP gets in, which means that effectively 75% have voted for other candidates and they're not being represented. And so then with these single member constituencies, some of whom have quite small support within their constituency, if you replicate that across the country, you often end up with governments with something like 30% support, and they have complete power in Parliament because they have a false majority in Parliament, and that basically means that most people's voices aren't being heard, and actually the government of the day is doing things against the will of most of the country.
So what's it like in other countries, the systems that other countries adopt?
So most democracies use forms of proportional representation, 80% of democracies in fact, and in OECD countries, the developed democracies, 85% use forms of proportional representation. Mainly the only countries that still use first past the post, there's obviously the UK, and then it's ex-colonies, and Azerbaijan, and a couple of other lesser known countries.
So all our friends in Europe are using versions of proportional representation?
Almost all of them. So France doesn't, but they are now looking to introduce some proportional representation as well.
So the problem, what we're saying is, it's a voting system that is not representative, therefore it's not democratic. So how can this be fixed?
Most democracies use proportional representation, and it's very straightforward. If a party gets, for example, 20% of the vote, they get 20% of the seats, or pretty close to that. There are different ways of achieving that, but that's less important than the principle that seats match votes. So Make Votes Matter as an organisation isn't campaigning for a specific voting system, we're just campaigning for the principle that seats match votes. Part of the reason for that is that as soon as you start talking about voting systems, all of the energy in trying to get electoral reform gets sucked into a systems debate. What we've just done this July, we launched the Good Systems Agreement, which was a culmination of a year and a half of work with the Make Votes Matter Alliance, and that includes all of the opposition parties in Britain, aside from Labour, but lots of Labour MPs, including Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell, and some of the Northern Irish parties, other parties like the Brexit Party, the Women's Equality Party, who aren't currently represented in Parliament. And they're all now saying we've agreed this Good Systems Agreement of 10 principles of good voting systems. So things like proportionality and things like accountability and diversity and so on. But we're not saying that we as campaigners or as parties or as all of the other public figures who signed up to this actually get to decide. We're saying the people should get to decide through a properly deliberative process like a citizens' assembly. So not a referendum, because at the moment there are problems with how we do referendums in the UK, and this isn't a statement against referendums per se, and it's certainly not a statement against any particular referendums in the UK, but it's about the fact that you need to have kind of transparency and honesty and not have influence of dark money, etc., in referendums. So people debating what our voting system should be have access to all of the facts and be able to call on other experts that maybe haven't been provided to them. They actually get to choose who they hear from, and they get to sit, for a series of weekends and figure out what would be the best system for the UK in particular.
Yeah, because people will say, well, there was a referendum in 2011 and we voted against proportional representation.
However, that wasn't actually on proportional representation. So that was the outcome of a deal between the Lib Dems and the Tories when they went into coalition. The Lib Dems have always campaigned for proportional representation. The Tories said, well, you can have a referendum on the voting system, but just on AV. And AV is the alternative vote, and that's another majoritarian system like first past the post, and it can be less proportional than first past the post.
Right, so it was just on a particular system rather than the whole principle.
Yeah.
Before that, there was a recommendation, wasn't there, from the Jenkins Commission or something, that we should go to have a proportional representation. Was that accepted by the... when was that? No, was that accepted
I don't remember which year it was exactly, but it obviously didn't go through.
Yeah, certainly didn't, did it? But then haven't we got in Scotland and Wales a certain element of...
We do, so all of the devolved administrations have systems of proportional representation. So Wales, Scotland, the London Assembly, they all have the additional member system. So that works like our first past the post system. You get one representative per constituency, but then there's a top-up list of MPs or assembly members, whatever they're called in that particular place, to make the overall picture proportional. But the systems used in those three different places vary. So, for example, in Wales, the top-up is relatively small and you don't get a fully proportional outcome. And in Scotland, it's a larger top-up and you get a much more proportional outcome. Our Good Systems Agreement, for example, says that a voting system should be at least as proportional as the Scottish system.
So all these other countries are using, or a large number of countries using proportional representation. There's been recommendations for proportional representation. Why is this not happening?
So first past the post advantages the two biggest parties, and in particular one of the two biggest parties. And it's in their interests, and they're the people in power, to keep it that way. So there's a huge amount of political science research around this, and basically there's a very strong right-wing bias to majoritarian systems, which means that often right-wing parties get into power more than the amount of times that the electorate is voting for them to be in power. So this isn't a partisan debate. This isn't, oh, we want left outcomes. It's just that we want the correct outcomes. Normally in this country, the Conservatives are in power, and that ties with the overall global picture of how this works, that it's skewing the results.
And is the party system dead now, do you think? I mean, not quite dead, but is it on its way out? Or is it going to fragment, or a two-party system?
The two-party system is definitely in a great deal of trouble. I don't know about the party system in general. I think there will always be groupings of representatives. How exactly that works, I'm sure could be improved. But the problem with first past the post is it gives this false advantage to the two biggest parties. And what that means is that it's in the interest of the parties to be broad churches, and some would say that's a good thing because it's great to have kind of consensus and collaboration, but it means that it's not transparent, so the voter can't actually see what they're voting for, what they'll get, and often having to vote tactically. If you're voting, for example, for the Conservatives, are you actually voting for pro-Brexit or a pro-Remain party? I mean, now it's quite clear, but it depends on the MP and the constituency. You might be voting for a pro-Remain Tory MP, but the party overall is pro-Leave. And that's the kind of the big division within the two big parties. It's the Remain and Leave thing. And that is, of course, why the EU referendum was called in the first place, because the Tory party has the Europhiles and the Europhobes and has had all of these decades, and they've been kind of drawing apart from each other. And David Cameron called the referendum because he was trying to hold the party together so they could continue to win under first past the post. He also thought that he wouldn't actually have to have the referendum because he thought he was going to be back in coalition with the Lib Dems who would prevent it from happening. So the whole thing was kind of created by first past the post and not something that even the person who was kind of calling for it intended to happen. And again, this isn't a statement on Remain or Leave. It's just that we're in a bit of a pickle now about Brexit, whatever your perspective on Brexit. I mean, the Leavers are screaming we should have left, and the Remainers are screaming we should remain. Nobody's happy. Everything is kind of ripping apart at the seams. And it's the same in the Labour Party as well. It's less transparent if you've got this kind of coalition, you don't actually know what it stands for.
So what to you then is the best system of proportional representation?
I don't have a favourite system of proportional representation. I'm very open-minded about the different systems that meet the principles of Good Systems Agreement. So it's really, the primary thing is that it's proportional. And that's because all of the evidence is that the outcomes come with a proportionality. From around the world, for many decades, political science has shown that you get better social, environmental, economic, political outcomes when you have proportional representation, which simply means real democracy, or kind of one of the basic stepping stones of real democracy. And so some examples of that would be that you get faster action on climate change, which is a really key thing right now. And I can't believe this isn't better known, but first past the post is the single strongest institutional predictor, which is a bit of a mouthful, but a huge predictor of whether a democracy will go to war. So first past the post is directly connected as a causal factor in going to war and staying in war.
So what can we the people do to make this change happen?
At Make Votes Matter, we've kind of got a few strands to our campaign. I've been talking about the Good Systems Agreement, which is about kind of bringing the parties together and public figures together to coordinate action for change. Then we're also putting pressure on Labour because they're the only opposition party that doesn't already fully support PR. So we need them on board if we're going to make this happen. And then the third part is the bit which is relevant to your question, is the grassroots. And so we have local groups around the country who are taking independent action for proportional representation, and we basically support any group that's working respectfully to get proportional representation for the House of Commons. And so they do all sorts of things like lobbying their MPs or going to speak to children in schools or holding street stalls. Like the North London group does a roadshow of street stalls all over the place, which is quite fun. And we do action days, so Demand Democracy Day, where you've got street stalls all over the country, and people signing up petitions to their MPs saying that they want PR. So that's one way to get involved, is to be involved locally. But you can also get involved online. You don't have to kind of go to a monthly meeting of a local group to be involved. So just being on the Make Votes Matter mailing list, you'll always find out what the kind of current most impactful action is that you can take. And that might be signing an open letter to the Prime Minister, or it might be something to do with the probable upcoming election, and so on.
So do you think with the sort of current breakdown in Parliament and the way things are happening in Parliament at the moment, do you think that's going to help us move towards changing the voting system?
Absolutely. I mean, it's horrific what's happening at the moment in our democracy, but I do think this chaos and this kind of breaking apart of our politics does create an opportunity for new politics to kind of come through that, real democracy to be born. The path towards democracy is not a straight one, but over time we've got kind of closer and closer in the UK. So some people think, oh, we've just always had democracy pretty much, well, we had kings and queens and then we got democracy. But actually each step has been really hard won, with a lot of struggle from people trying to wrest a little bit more power away from those who are in power. People have been campaigning for proportional representation for over 130 years in this country. The suffragettes were campaigning for a very long time before they even started doing the kind of direct action that they became famous for, played a part in women finally getting the vote. Hopefully we're not going to have to go to the lengths that the suffragettes did to get proportional representation. Well, I personally don't want to go on hunger strike in prison and be force fed, but I'm willing to do what needs to be done to get PR.
I'm really pleased to hear that, and I'm right up there with you. The other thing that I find staggering about our democratic system here, and the polls support it, is all these issues which we would call the real agenda, poverty, inequality and economic and social justice, are not being addressed. The 14 million people in poverty, what's being done to change that? What's being done to put the minimum wage up to a real living wage?
Yeah.
What's been done to change council tax so that, as it used to be when renters didn't have to pay, to really build affordable houses and sort the issue with land? None of these things are being addressed. So poverty continues and things like that. And this seems to me, because it's the voting system, is just getting people then not paying attention to what the people want.
Yeah, Brexit is currently sucking up all of the parliamentary time and a lot of the country's time, and yes, it's an important issue and we need to resolve it, and I would like to see it resolved through a process of consensus, which hasn't even been happening yet at all. But yes, that is a consequence of us not having proportional representation. And so if we did have representative democracy, which is supposedly what we are, then we could deal with all of those things.
And then we'd actually see change, positive change.
Yes, and we urgently need to make that change happen, because we are in an existential crisis with climate change at the moment.
Okay, good. Well, thanks very much. That's great. And I wish you all the best with what you're trying to do. And I'm right behind you there, because we've got to do it.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Klina. That was most enlightening, and it's just so important. You can find out more and get involved at makevotesmatter.org.uk. So what do you think? Contact us at info@realagenda.org or via our website, realagenda.org. We'd love to hear your views, and we hope we've helped to inform, involve and inspire you into action. Now, coming up soon on The Real Agenda, there's our new Profit for Purpose series about how about being a better business and have capitalism work for a more sustainable and fair economy. We will be talking to Paul Lindley, founder of Ella's Kitchen, and also to Julian Richer, founder of Richer Sounds. Plus, of course, our weekly studio show that's out every Friday morning, the Weekly Wake Up, which raises the alarm on what's really happening in our country, which I'm sure a lot of us don't quite know what's going on, and then what can we do about it? Now, special thanks to our sponsors, Reverse Media Group, one of the fastest growing search and media companies. Find out why at reversemediagroup.com. And don't just take my word for it. Reverse Media Group is just listed as the 9th fastest growing private tech company in the UK. Now, one thing is certain. People want to see change to a more compassionate and just society, as well as more courageous politicians prepared to do the right thing for people over party. It's urgent and it's up to us to make it happen. That's The Real Agenda. I'm Tom Burgess. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.